means that we're bringing in everybody. So welcome to our EPD 101 webinar, everybody. So I think your people are arriving. So I'll just give it a few more seconds before we kick off. So thank you very much for spending your time with us on this rather grey November day. Certainly is here in southeast Kent, where I am. So my name is Simon Corby. I'm the CEO at the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And welcome to our webinar. So this is an introduction to EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations. And I'm so delighted to be collaborating with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors World Built Environment Forum. So I am a member of RICS. I qualified in the last century. I'm not going to give you the exact date but yeah, so I've been a surveyor for quite some time. So I'm so pleased that we're collaborating in this event, and I look forward to doing more. So the program for today is you've got a few moments with me, and then I'm going to hand over to Frank Hovorka. So he's kindly given up his time to come and speak to us from Paris. And then we have our resident life cycle analysis expert, Jane Anderson, to walk you through the basics. And that's really what we're trying to do today, because these documents are quite complex. So it is EPD 101. We will look to do other events around EPD, and we're going to get some feedback from you as we finish up to see what type of events you have an appetite for. And then at 1:20, we're going to be joined by Mark Lynn, who's Managing Director of Thermofleece and also the Chair of the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And so Mark will give you the manufacturer's perspective of achieving EPDs for their products. And then we've got a quarter of an hour for a bit of Q&A and a bit of chat, and then we'll finish up promptly at 2:00. So just a few little bits of housekeeping. So please add your questions as we go along to the Q&A. I quite like to take questions pretty much straight away, certainly after each speaker. So we'll aim to dedicate a little bit of time to deal with any questions. You can upvote these questions. So if that sort of resonates with you, just upvote them and we'll take it from the top. So please introduce yourself on the chat. We missed the sort of cups of tea and chats previous and prior to an event. So just introduce yourself on the chat so that we know who you are and other people can see that you're here and that you've joined us. Please don't use the raise hand option because we're not monitoring that. And I'm joined by my colleague Larry. So if you have a technical problem, put a message in the chat to him. So we are recording the webinar. We will be sending you a recording, and we will be sending you the speakers' presentations and their slides. So yeah, just be mindful of the fact that you can always watch again and catch up if you lose us or you get interrupted, and we will be sending the slides to you. So just as a quick reminder as to who we are and what we do, we're a not-for-profit organization. We're mission-led. So our mission is here to accelerate the transformation to a healthy, low-carbon built environment by championing the use of demonstrably sustainable building products. So you can see this demonstrably bit is where environmental product declarations really come in as far as we're concerned. So what do? Well, we share learning through our events. We have a range of research projects. We create guidance, we collaborate as widely as we can, and we aim to influence policy and a lot more besides. And we have these lenses that we try and look through. So it's not just about carbon. We've got to think about health and well-being. We've got to think about biodiversity. We've got to think about social value and technical performance. So it really is trying to make sure that we think of all of these things as we move on. So yeah, so it's just a quick slide to an overview of our activities. So we've just completed a research project, Innovate UK research project on steel reuse. We have an ongoing project around mass timber and biodiversity and trying to trace timber back to its forest of origin. We focus very heavily on natural materials, biogenic materials. We've got a research project on how we can use biogenic products in retrofit with a range of universities. We have 4 specialist working groups. So we've got reducing plastics, healthy paints and finishes, and natural fiber insulation. So we brought all the competitors together, or all the people who are involved in this together, to work together and collaborate. So we've got a membership now. I think we're 155. We've got lots of guidance and toolkits. So this is a picture of our mass timber insurance playbook. So that has just been endorsed by the Association of British Insurers and the RICS Authority and the Fire Protection Association. So we're reissuing that on the 4th of December. Yeah, and we're doing our awards in the summer next year. So we'll have a summertime event for those. Next week, we are meeting in person at the Building Centre. So I'm so delighted that we're going to be joined by Tina Paye. Tina is the current president of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and Tina has agreed to come along and offer a keynote. And we've got a range of developers, including Grosvenor and British Land, coming to talk to us about their trials and tribulations in looking at reuse. And we'll be introducing the demolition industry to you guys, and lots of time for networking. So do join us for that, and that's next Thursday from 1 o'clock. And then we've got a range of events coming along. Tomorrow, we've got an event on the Building Safety Act and what it means for low carbon construction. We're at London Build Expo on the 20th, 21st of November. So come along. We've got a couple of talks and we have a stand. We're doing an event on integrated project insurance on the 26th. The 4th is our relaunch of our mass timber insurance playbook. And then that week, we've got a European series of events with Nature Plus, which is an eco label. So do please sign up to our free newsletter and get involved. So thank you for your patience and attention there. So I've now got the honor of handing over to Frank. So Frank Hovorka is joining us from Paris. And so thanks once again, Frank, for joining us today. Really delighted to see you. So I'm going to hand over to you and ask you to share your slides and take the podium, if you would.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the possibility to share some information, and I'm also waiting for your feedbacks during this conversation, because a lot of things are happening right now around the world, and of course, because I'm based in Paris, I will focus on what's happening now in the European Union, but I'm in contact with colleagues also in Australia or North America, where a lot of similar things are happening. And well, what I will try to do, because I know that you will have more detailed presentation on the whole life cycle carbon assessment standard, what was developed by RICS and a lot of other stakeholders. So I think you will have more information about the standard by itself and how to use the environmental product declaration with this life cycle assessment standard. I will try to start with an overview of what's going on with the data we need, and why we need this data. Because in fact, we of course, as you said, we have to look after greenhouse gas emission, but also other topics like biodiversity and other impacts. But I will focus clearly on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's quite important to have an origin about that. It all started with, of course, the IPCC report and the report on the greenhouse gas emissions that have a clear impact on the climate and the acceleration of the climate change. But as we are now, we have to face with the same unit, CO2 equivalent per square meter per year or CO2 equivalent, different impacts. Because we clearly, and I like very much this CO2 flows. It gives you what do we do and what we are doing. So from travel, thermal comfort, food, alimentation, what kind of equipment we use, what kind of device, what kind of final energy, and what are the final emissions linked to the service we need as human being from the beginning. And it's quite important to have that in mind, because the CO2 emissions will depend, of course, on the service you expect, but also on the material or equipment you are using and how this material is made in the factory, and what is the fuel source at the factory, because it will have an impact on the embedded CO2. What also I want to insist on, it's we use the same unit CO2, but it's we have to have in mind that when you look at the declarations, there is also the need to look at, if we are talking about only CO2 emissions, which are only the CO2 emissions, and if we are also looking at the other gas, which has that kind of gas, but who has also a warming power, and then we see that one of the main, the most important one is, of course, CH4, but we are also impacted in our business by CFCs and HFCs, which are the gases that we use mainly in heat pumps or air conditioning system. So it has clearly an impact. But having said that, we have also a third metric. So you see, we have CO2, CO2 equivalent, but we have also a third metric, which is the life cycle assessment, which is also expressed in CO2 equivalent per year, but it's totally different calculation, because we look at the embedded carbon in building materials, then we look at the use stage of a building, where we look at the emissions linked to the energy consumption of a building by itself, but we also include the impact of replacement, repair, and refurbishment according the lifespan, which is indicated in the product declaration. And we can also look after the post-use of a building and the end-of-life stage. So I will not go deeper on that, because I'm sure that my colleagues later on will go much more deeper in details. But it's important to have in mind that when we speak about CO2, and when we are looking about how to deliver information back to the market, we are using the CO2 equivalent per square meter per year, same unit, but we are not saying the same thing when we speak about impact on life cycle assessment, CO2 emission yearly by the energy consumption of a building, or CO2 emissions that are done once when you build the building at a certain stage during the construction phase. So it's very important to have that in mind, because it's in what I will say later on, the declaration that we will use, you will have to use the different definition when you will have to report to other stakeholders. What I want to insist on is if we look at the data list in Europe, we are mainly using, in terms of energy, the energy performance certificate, and I put also the threshold for nearly zero energy building in Europe. So you see that if we are talking about energy performance certificate in primary energy, we are between 40 to 80 kilowatt in primary energy per square meter per year. We also have another problem when we are talking about energy performance and carbon emissions, of course, because when we look at the building by itself, by different regulation in Europe or in around the world, you look at what is building-related emissions and energy use that can be regulated or unregulated. In every system, we don't take into account a non-building related energy use, which is plugged into the building. But when you look at the CO2 emissions yearly in the national definition, we have to take it in account. So it's not in the regulation, but you have to take it in account in the national declaration yearly. And of course, after we have all the problems of definition with on-site production, imported energy, exported energy, and on-site renewable energy production. If I go now for the regulation in Europe with the products, we now have a new regulation, which is called Digital Product Passport. And the Digital Product Passport normally will help any stakeholder, economic operator, consumer, market authority, or users to have an access to a digital registry data of Digital Product Passport. And this Digital Product Passport embed the environmental product declaration. So the idea of a regulation now in Europe to be developed by 2034 or 35, so in the next 10 years, we should achieve in the next period in Europe this diagram that shows you a database of digital product declaration that can be used by every stakeholder, which embed the environmental product declaration. And the environmental product declaration that we have could be done this way, based on the structure of existing standards that you know that are quoted in the slide and the standards that you already know. The idea is to have a product declaration data sheet which is standardized, which is done and edited by the industry and the supplier, that could be used into the certification process. So it could be any certification process that we have here, or like in France, in the regulation that we have, which is mandatory to do a life cycle assessment for each building. And then it can be used in the handover documentation of the building. The challenge we have to face now in this digital product passport and environmental product declaration is an harmonized approach with the same definition, the value, the weight was measured or calculated, the weight was certified, and we need to have for each product a unique identification tag in order to identify a product into a building or into a digital twin. So this is really the challenge for the European Union in this new regulation to be tackled, and it will take, as I said, at least 5 to 6 years to finalize this work to achieve such a standards on data templates and data sharing. You can have here an example of how this ISO standards is used for data templates of your environmental product declaration. But what is interesting is something we have worked, for example, with our colleagues in the northern countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden. The idea is to have an environmental product declaration which is produced by the industry and the supplier. This information is then sent to a database depository, which are now these companies that you have under the name of company PIMS. It could be used by a machine-to-machine readable system, because you can't do a life cycle assessment without that, because you can't do it on an Excel sheet. If you have to face up 400, 500, 600 type of components into a building, it's impossible to manage all the data in another way than to have a machine-to-machine readable system. And then you can have this design, and you have also the impact on the construction. So the standards are existing. It's ISO standards. It works. What we don't have is now the interoperability and the data readable machine-to-machine system in order to move easily from the EPDs to the database, to the lifecycle assessment tools, into the certification process in order to achieve that. But the idea behind is not only to have an information about environmental product declaration embedded in the building and how it works. It's also to work on impact that it could have on the finance. And I will show you that because it's something we have developed for Europe and how to achieve a sustainable portfolio or sustainable building. We also are pushed by the regulation, carbon regulation in Europe, market requirement, and of course, financial regulation. I know that it's not obvious, but we are really pushed by the financial regulation, by all these corporate and social reporting directives that we have to face up, because every company has to report its CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions into a standardized reporting system. And all that is now worldwide accepted, because if you look on this diagram that a friend of mine did for Deloitte, you see that it's something which is worked in US, in UK, of course, Australia, Canada, and Europe. And it's the pathway is roughly the same. We will integrate information into extra financial reporting and integrated reporting. It will have an impact on your extra financial reporting as a company, and it has to be audited, and it has to be in a way that it's standardized in order to be audited and to verify your level of greenhouse gas emission. And part of that is the embedded carbon in the materials and the construction material. So everything is linked between the information given by industry about the embedded carbon of a product till the whole life cycle assessment of a building that has an impact on the extra financial report of a company and its economical value in the coming years because of these regulations that are going to be in place in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Splendid, thanks, Frank. So just to be clear, in France, so how is it working? Are you having to do whole life carbon calculations for every building, or is it built every building, even a house?
Yeah, of course, that it has started with housing. So since 1st of January 2022, we have to, it's mandatory, make a life cycle assessment. This life cycle assessment is done based on a core calculation methodology, which is mandatory and developed by the French Scientific Center for Buildings. So you can't use any other software. You have to go with the software, and the software gets the inputs, the data from the products from the French database. Is only one database you can use, the French one, and all the products has to be registered into this database in terms of environmental product declaration. And they have to go through a certification with a French system of auditing of the quality of the EPD in order to be registered into this database.
So UK manufacturers who have invested in an EPD, but they presumably need to go through additional checks and balances, or is it a whole new EPD that they need to do?
Well, it's tricky because in France we have what we call a dynamic life cycle assessment calculation, which we take in account more the biogenic carbon stock at the end of life. So yes, in a way, you will have to do a new life cycle assessment to be aligned with a French mandatory life cycle assessment, which diverge from the ISO standard, unfortunately.
Right.
And what we are facing now is that we have a clear lack of EPDs, and because we can't use UK or any other environmental product declaration from Europe, the state has decided to give average value for certain family of products because we don't have enough EPDs.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Frank. There is a question in the Q&A, which is for you. which is around BIM. And I'd be ever so grateful if you wouldn't mind trying to respond to that question. It's quite technical. I'm not sure that I could answer it, but I'm hoping you might be able to.
I don't see it in the chat, so
It's in the Q&A. So it's about the BIM model. So I'm going to hand over now to and let's get this right. It's Dr. Jane Anderson. So Jane has fairly recently completed her PhD on environmental product declarations. If you're interested in reading Jane's PhD, you can go to our website, and if you click on Jane's picture, you'll see a link to her PhD, which I have literally just downloaded. So a little bit of I was going to say bedtime reading. That's probably not the best time to read it, but there's Jane's a fascinating PhD there. So thank you ever so much to Dr. Jane Anderson, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. And I have been told it is quite a good read for a PhD thesis. So anyway, that's a little bit about me, but I've been working on EPDs for too long to remember, unfortunately. So what are environmental product declarations? It's basically a way of providing information about a product using life cycle assessment. But the really important thing is that there's a set of product category rules so that you're able to measure products consistently rather than everybody inventing their own approach, which is the case with LCA generally. So in theory, then, EPD that produced with the same product category rules can then be compared. If you want more information about environmental product declarations, a kind of brief introduction, because I can't necessarily cover absolutely everything, there is an information paper available from the ASBP, and the link is on the slides, and the slides will be available afterwards. There are lots of different EPD programs, and for construction products in Europe and quite a lot of the rest of the world, we use a PCR called EN 15804, so a European standard that provides the product category rules for construction products. There are lots of EPD programs in Europe and around the world that use this standard, and I'll show you them. So these EPDs in different programs look different, but they all have the same common content and follow the same rules. And one of the key kind of rules is the way that we break down the life cycle. And you saw in Frank's slides, you saw the same kind of life cycle diagram, because this is used in Europe for products, construction products, for buildings and for infrastructure. So it's the same format framework throughout all of those, which means that the EPD data can then basically just be plugged into a building LCA or an infrastructure LCA in the way that Frank was kind of mentioning. So you've got all these different modules, and it's mandatory in EPD to provide the product stage, so A1 to A3, so basically all the impacts up until it leaves the factory gate, and the end of life, and module D, which is around not necessarily circular economy really, but about the benefits of certainly recovering primary products, I would say. And these other modules are optional, although in France they're mandatory, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, an EPD that you've produced in another country wouldn't directly be able to go into the French database, because you'd have to assess these modules and also do it in the context of the French situation. So your end of life would need to be based on what would happen to the product in France. So that's another reason why your EPD wouldn't directly be able to go into the French database, but all the information about having made it theoretically can do. So it would be not a question of having to produce a completely new EPD to put it into the French database. But the problem is that the queue of verifiers, I'm afraid, in France, which is the same in a lot of other countries as well. In terms of what information they contain, it's not just carbon, although carbon tends to be the indicator that we focus on most of all with things like embodied carbon. But you'll see here, there's a whole long list of what we call core indicators that are mandatory in every EPD. These resource indicators and indicators about the amount of material that's kind of available for reuse or recycling. Based on the scenarios, and they do now give you information on biogenic carbon content, and again that information is what's used in France when they look at the long-term kind of benefits of carbon storage. It doesn't mean you have to do a different EPD, it's just the way they actually do it at the building level that's different. In terms of the international perspective, this is showing you kind of the range of countries that have EPD and those that have a lot of them. You can see that there are a lot in Europe, but there are now a lot, for example, in Australia, in China, and a lot in North America and Canada, and kind of Mexico, starting to get them in Latin America as well, and quite a lot in the kind of Middle East and India. So it is really becoming quite a global phenomena for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss. And in terms of how many EPD there are, this is just EPD to 15804 that are published through an EPD programme, and there's nearly 25,000 of them at the start of this year. And when Frank says there's not enough EPD in France, the French ones are basically these two kind of brown ones. You'll see they are amongst the biggest EPD programs, and they still don't have enough EPD in terms of providing EPD for every single product group. It's also effectively, if you use a proxy EPD in France in their building level assessments, if there isn't another generic data set, then there's a very high uplift. You basically double the impact. So it's kind of advantageous to have EPDs in the French database. But there are kind of at least another 30,000 EPDs that are available in tools that have been verified for European products, and then around 70,000 EPD in North America. So that there just are a lot of EPD out there. And the ASBP has a database. Again, the link is here. These are all the EPD for ASBP members. So there are quite a lot of them, and you'll see the Thermopolice EPD there for Mark will be talking about later. So how are EPD being used? So France, again, is one of the leaders in this. I think it was in 2012, they introduced legislation that said if you made an environmental claim about a construction product in France, you would have to have an EPD that you had to register in the French EPD program. They have similar legislation in Belgium. So basically, you have to have an EPD to justify any claims that you make. In Norway, their public procurement rules, there's actually a requirement to have, I think it's at least 10 products that have EPDs in large public projects. In Italy, EPDs are a way of providing evidence about recycled content because they have requirements for public buildings to have a specific percentage of recycled content. BREEAM and LEED, the building assessment systems, both have credits for using products with EPDs. Then in Germany and in Belgium, they have requirements to assess public buildings, not yet private buildings, but publicly funded buildings. They have to do building LCA assessments. And if you use products with EPDs that show a reduction, then obviously that helps you to actually achieve those assessments and to reach the targets that they set, for example, in Germany for public buildings. And then there are now a lot of countries across Europe that are regulating the assessment of embodied impacts. So as Frank mentioned, in France, it's now a requirement for all buildings to assess their embodied carbon. In the Netherlands, it's been a requirement since 2012 to do building LCA. And Denmark, Finland, and Sweden have all recently introduced regulations to require assessment of carbon. And again, in those situations, they have target levels in France and the Netherlands, and they're bringing them in in these other countries. If you want to achieve these levels, you're going to have to potentially look at how you can reduce the embodied carbon of your building. And to do that, one approach is to use EPDs to find products and solutions that have lower embodied carbon. But there again is lots more information in the briefing paper with the link there. Another question that we get asked, will it be mandatory to produce EPD? And the answer in Europe is yes. So effectively, starting from next year with steel and concrete, and then ongoing until around 2040, potentially earlier than that. Construction products that are marketed in the EU and that are covered by either the Construction Products Regulation or the Eco Design Regulation will have to at first provide the GWP or embodied carbon information that comes from an EPD, and then all the LCA information, I think 4 years later, and that will be done as part of CE marking, and again using that digital product passport that Frank talked about. So it will be mandatory if you market your products in the EU, or if you're in the EU and you want to use a construction product, it will have to have an EPD, and they've prioritized the products with the ones that have the biggest impact to be done first, although sectors can fast track. So yeah, over time, eventually all products that are used in buildings will have to provide environmental information, effectively like an EPD. It will have to be verified like an EPD, but done through a certification body or a notified body, and provided as part of CE marking. Another kind of way, and particularly if those of you are in the UK, and that should say, yeah, the UK will do it in future. The International Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, which the UK is one of the leads on, is developing a process of setting requirements for public bodies to purchase low carbon steel and concrete. It's very likely that will be based on EPD results or the CE marking. And in fact, already Canada, Germany, and the USA have requirements for public bodies, at least some of their public bodies, to do that. So the UK is once again behind. And by 2028, this isn't a requirement for EPD, but by 2028, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive means that all large buildings in the EU member states will have to assess embodied carbon, and all new buildings by 2030. And again, when we get those kind of requirements, we see that is a massive pull for EPD data. It won't be mandatory, but we expect it to be a very, very big driver for EPD, alongside, as I say, the actual requirement to provide it. Although for many products that won't be until after 2030. In terms of using EPD for green claims, to basically counter greenwashing, EPD are independently verified by an experienced expert who has to be approved by an EPD program. And if it's an eco-platform EPD program that's been audited, then basically they've been checked to ensure that they make sure their verifiers are fully qualified, and that they use a very detailed verification checklist to verify EPDs, which ensures quality. I've already said that in France and Germany, it's already a requirement that you have to have an EPD if you make an environmental claim about a construction product. And in the UK, we have something called the Green Claims Code, which is clear that your claims mustn't be misleading, they must be robust and cover the whole life cycle. And at EPD are able to provide that evidence. And there you have the Green Claim Code. So, for example, it has to cover the full life cycle of the product, and you can't leave something out. So you can't say, you know, omit the fact that it's actually a very heavy carbon emitter during its use stage, if you can't just talk about one stage of the life cycle. And there is similar legislation coming in Europe as well. So again, EPD will be useful there. In terms of looking at EPD and sort of if you're actually kind of collecting them, some basics, we do have a link here to the top 10 things to look out that gives you more information on this. I've mentioned Eco Platform, so it's an organisation of EPD programmes that looks to ensure the quality and consistency of data. So using programs that are Eco Platform, have been audited by Eco Platform, is a good guarantee of quality, and the EPD will have an Eco Platform Eco logo on it. Check whether your EPDs are valid, particularly if you're downloading PDFs. Always go to the EPD program and double check, because there may have been, for example, a change to the product, either the manufacturer's changed something or an error has been identified. So always try to download the most recent version. If you're looking at several EPD, look at the functional or declared unit and see how it actually relates to the product that you'll install. So, for example, for something like plasterboard or concrete blocks, you might see that some of them do impacts per metre squared, some of them per tonne, some of them per cubic metre. You'll need to convert all of them to a common declared unit so that you can actually make a comparison and work out what the impact of the product that you're going to install in the building is. Always look at the product description. Is it actually the product that you think it is? Look at the scope. Does it provide information on transport and installation and maintenance? And if so, is it appropriate to your building? So if it's transport, you know, how far does it, you know, are you actually importing it from overseas that have much bigger transport distances than are provided in the EPD? It will give information on biogenic carbon in the packaging. And the product. So you can look at the benefits of carbon storage, as is done, for example, in France, and data on the end of life phase. It's mandatory to provide that, but the scenarios may not be relevant to your building. So, for example, you may be designing for deconstruction so that more of the product would be reused, or it might be that the end of life disposal in the country where you are is different. There might be no incinerators and much more recycling, for example, or vice versa. And again, the manufacturing location and the year of the data is that where you would be sourcing the product from, and how recent is the data. And then, of course, there's the LCA results, but there's much more about that in, as I say, that briefing paper. In terms of where you can find EPD, I've put a list on the left-hand side of the most common sources of EPD data. So the Eco Platform Eco Portal has all of the members, all of the audited members, EPDs, except for the French because they have their own database, so that's there as well. The Belgian EPD database, you have to register to access that. It's run by the government, and they're not able to join Eco Platform because they're a government. It's a bit weird. Building Transparency is based in the States. They have a lot of European EPDs and most or all of the US and Canadian EPDs. Again, you have to register, but that's a very good source of kind of American, North American EPDs. EPD Hub is one of the biggest programs that not yet an audited program, so its EPDs not yet in the Eco Portal. And then Tata Steel and European Aluminium aren't members of, aren't audited EPD programs. So I've listed those because they're certainly the Tata one has quite a lot of UK EPDs. And we do have a paper here, and I need to add the link that gives you much more information, but that's available on the ASBP website. In terms of selecting data, this is a very rapid run through. Two types of data. We call generic data is basically typical or average data. So there are sector EPDs that are generic data, if they're, for example, for the UK cement sector. Specific data is manufacturer specific data, and that's generally only available as EPDs. So something like sector EPDs or the ICE database would be generic data, and manufacturer specific EPDs would be specific data. And in terms of selecting data, basically in these early stages, the kind of when you're doing initial designs in the very beginning of kind of technical design, it's best generally to be using generic data because you're not actually sure which manufacturer's product you're going to be using, and it will give you a good average, if you like. As you move through, ideally, you should be looking for specific data for the products that you're using. So if they've got EPD, you should be linking to those, particularly for kind of post as-built and construction assessments. So if there is an EPD, that's where you would be using it. In terms of as-built assessments and how you should select data when there isn't an EPD, in the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, which has just been launched, in the pilot version, there is this diagram here telling you, it's basically a kind of flow chart of how to select data and looking at different types of data that might be available. And it follows, and I'll show you this then, but the RICS professional standard on whole life carbon, which looks at uncertainty of data. So in theory, this kind of goes through and tries to identify the data that would be the most relevant and have the lowest uncertainty available. So have a look at that. It's only suitable, as I say, though, for kind of post-construction or when you actually know exactly what product you want to use. If you're at an early stage, then basically generic data would be the better data to use. And as I mentioned, the RICS professional statement has what we call a carbon uncertainty factor, which is one of the three kind of things that join together to give you the uncertainty that you need to add to your assessments from technical design phase onwards to kind of account for uncertainty. And the carbon uncertainty factor is basically used, it just looks at the carbon data. There's another one for the design stage that you're at and another for the quantities data. The carbon data only applies to the 10 carbon data sets that have the biggest impact in terms of embodied carbon over the life of the building. So you only need to look in detail at the 10 data sets that contribute the most in terms of embodied carbon. And for each of these data sets, what you're doing is comparing the actual products that you've installed in the building to the data set that you've used to represent them. And you're looking at kind of geography, technology, and time, essentially, and some other aspects which I'll show you. And if you have a manufacturer-specific EPD for the actual product, that's likely to have the lowest uncertainty. And if you were using a proxy data set or average data from a different region, for example, then that would have much lower data confidence. So it uses this matrix. It's available in the standard, and it basically looks, as I say, at geography, and you're basically making a comparison here between the geography of the actual product that you've used, where it was made, and the data set that you're using. And I'll give you some examples. The same for technology in terms of the top technology used to make the actual product, and your data set, how specific the data is, and then how old the data is, and then the kind of how specific it is in terms of granularity, how many kind of manufacturers it's covering, and then whether it's been verified or not. And I'll give you some examples. So this one, if you've installed a lightweight block made by a particular company that doesn't have an EPD, and you've used the ICE database data, for example, then in terms of geography, that would actually be very good, because the ICE database is intended for use in the UK. It uses data sets that are relevant to the UK, so the geography would be good. But the actual data set in ICE is actually for medium dense concrete, not lightweight aggregate concrete. And so it only partially reflects the technology. And in terms of specificity, its ICE database is very much an average data set, therefore kind of only fair in terms of its quality here. And then as it's a generic data set, we use this column here for its temporal representativeness. And the ICE database was basically last published in 2019. They are about to launch a new version. So it would come in here because it's the reference year or publication was is more than 5 years. And then in terms of the data, the granularity, it's regional sector EPD data, and it hasn't been verified or peer reviewed. So when you add up these scores that you've got here, you get 25 points out of 40. Whereas if, for example, you used a particular EPD that does have an EPD here, roasted thermal light block, lightweight aggregate block, then you could actually use their own EPD, and here it actually gets top marks except for the year of data collection, because that was more than 4 years ago from the year that you'd be installing it in the building. So that would get 38 points out of 40. So hopefully that kind of helps you to understand how that works.
2 minutes, Dave,
sorry?
2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I think we're fine. Making comparisons with other products, it's really important. You can compare different types of products. So you can compare apples and oranges. If you were looking at calorific value, let's say, you wouldn't be able to compare them in other ways. So 15804 provides rules for comparison. So long as the products provide the same functional requirements as defined by legislation or the client's brief, then you can make a comparison. So you can compare, for example, a blockwork wall and a timber frame wall, so long as they do all the things that building regs and your client wants that wall to do. They don't have to be, they can be made out of different types of material. But you need to make sure that you've basically included everything. So you would need not just the blocks, but the mortar, for example. So you're taking account of ancillary materials and other parts of the system. And yeah, so you need to do that. If you exclude something, so you could for example, exclude the paint because it might be the same for the two systems. And if you were comparing, I don't know, different types of brick, you could exclude the end of life if that was basically going to be the same. And anything that has any impact on the operation of the building, so for example, its thermal performance, you need to take that into account. And you need to check that your EPDs have been calculated consistently. But those are the kind of rules. Things to watch out for. You need to check the scope of the EPD, what's included. So has it included water or does it exclude it, for example? Can you convert the EPD to the same declared unit? So for example, if you've got your blocks and some are in meters cubed, some are in tons, some are in kilograms, you'd need to make a comparison to get them to a meter squared so that you could actually compare 1 meter squared of walls made with the different blocks. As I say, yeah, the ancillary items like mortar, do they have different service lives? So you might be looking at roof tiles, for example. Would you expect one to last longer, in which case you need to take that into account? And yeah, again, the end of life, is there some reason why, particularly if the EPDs say different things about what happens to them, would it actually be the same, and is it relevant? And my closing slide, what emerging technologies are actually coming. So the built environment carbon database hopefully will be becoming more useful in terms of finding EPDs that are relevant to the UK. I've mentioned the EC3 database, but it does have a very good way for a lot of products of finding products that have particular performance characteristics, and it can look at location. EPD Analyzer, we had a webinar that Brands and Values talked about, but they do have a tool that you can use to actually make comparisons between EPD and to visualize EPD results and try and kind of understand them in a more sort of kind of visual way. As Frank mentioned, digital product passports, but this data, it will all be digitized, and hopefully that will make a lot of things much easier potentially in the future to find data and to be able to use it and to select products. And OneClick have just launched a materials compass, which is a subscription-based service, but it includes a lot of EPD and helps you to make comparisons. I've not looked at it. That might be useful technology, and I think that is me. Thank you very much.
Superb, Jane. Thank you very much. You can pause for breath because I'm not sure you did. So thank you very much. That was a really good barnstorming session through the EPD 101. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but maybe I'm going to ask you to have a look at those, Jane, and we'll press on in the interests of time because inevitably we're running slightly behind. So I'd like to welcome to the podium Mark Lynn, who's the chair of the Alliance of Sustainable Building Products and is the managing director at Thermofleece. So I'll hand over to you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. I'll just quickly share my screen.
Great. Yeah, we can.
Is that okay?
Want to put it into full screen mode?
Yeah, bear with me.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. As Simon said, I'm MD of Eden Renewables, which is the company behind Thermofleece wool insulation. I'm also chair of the ASBP. And if you're a product manufacturer, and particularly an SME product manufacturer, and you haven't scarpered based on what you've heard, then this might be of some interest to you. So Thermofleece is a natural fibre insulation made from British sheep's wool, and it's made in Yorkshire since 1999, which is 25 years. I've been involved for about 20 now. And if you didn't know, there's 14 million sheep in Britain, and they produce about 23 million kilos of wool a year, of which about 5 million kilos is suitable for insulation, which is essentially the lower value coarse wool. And that wool value, the reason why I've mentioned it, does have a bearing on the overall impact of the product, because it plays a role in how we allocate the impacts of the farming to the various components that are produced. Other brands, we've got our Super Soft, which is a recycled polyester PT insulation, hemp-based insulation, Natural Hemp, and a Thermofloc, which is a recycled newspaper. And we've got third-party verified EPDs for the Super Soft and the Thermofloc, not for the Natural Hemp. It's a very small part of our business, but we're working on that. We are an SME. We've got quite a reach. You know, just you can see here some of the brands that, some of the clients that have used our products. And I'm pretty certain, I know looking at those, there's definitely a few that we wouldn't have been in the specification without an EPD. So it's definitely providing a return, financial return for the investment there. And we've been featured on various media. We've even been featured on Coronation Street. Don't ask me about that. So why an EPD? Well, I think the first thing is it supports green claims, because, you know, I'm committed to this sustainable built environment, but you can't just take my word for it. So you need evidence to back up what you say, and we've heard that from the two previous speakers, and it shows a commitment to transparency and objectivity as well. And I think transparency is key to the future of the built environment. And it's interesting because an EPD isn't a statement that something is sustainable or not. I know I've certainly heard Jane say that. I don't know if she mentioned it in the presentation, but she certainly made a point of it in the past, and it's true that having an EPD is not a statement that a product is sustainable. An EPD is a report that shows in a verifiable, objective way that a product has various impacts across a series of categories. Now, it may well be that that product is sustainable and that's demonstrable through the EPD, but it's an important point to make. The EPD also, and the LCA stage of the EPD also informs product development. And just going back to the end of this slide, it's very important for us and our culture as a business that we don't see these things as a tick box. And that's how we internalize these things. It's very easy to approach an EPD and I see it as a tick box, but that's sort of, you start to fester a pretty cynical culture in your business when you start to think about those things. So you've got to embrace it and see how informative it can be internally and how useful it can be externally. And for us, it's part of a bigger picture. So we have our ISO 14001, our carbon footprint and our carbon reduction plan, and then the verified EPD. And then again, because we have a bio-based material and there is a biogenic carbon storage benefit to that we can then use data from the EPD to inform claims that we make about the biogenic carbon storage benefit, which we do separately from the standard. And I'll talk about that a little bit as well. I think I haven't mentioned it in the slide, but I picked up on it from the two previous presentations. I think if you're a manufacturer, and SME in particular, best thing to do is to not focus on the building level stuff until you've got an EPD, because it'll just blow your mind. And if getting the EPD is daunting enough, starting to look at the whole life carbon assessment methodology and the net zero carbon building standard and all that kind of stuff is just going to bamboozle you even more. So I would tend to focus on the EPD side of things. Reservations, naturally, it's potentially seen as a very onerous process, but you put that as a positive and you think, well, if people are being rigorous and it's an onerous process, it means that it's going to add to the credibility of the data and the subsequent report. How do you comprehend the processes? Well, if you're a manufacturer, the person that best understands what you do is you. So a good expert will be able to tease that out, understand what the processes are, and then shape it into the right way for you. How best to use an EPD? You know, I'm fortunate in that I've been sort of involved on the periphery of LCA for a long time, so I'm not coming at this completely in the dark. But, you know, again, our culture, it's the same with our ISO 14001. It is not a tick box. These are things that you can use and make yourself, you know, weave into the culture of your business, which is much easier to do as an SME. I appreciate that, you know. We decide that that's what we're going to do, and we make it happen. How do you understand an EPD? Because it's not just about how I understand an EPD. Everyone in the business has got to understand it. And again, we weave that into the training, and we've got some good things that I can share with you that we've done on that. And a natural reservation is what happens if the result isn't as good as we thought it would be? Well, the result is what the result is, and it's better that you understand your product and that you can stand behind something rather than an opinion at the back of your mind you think's a bit shaky. So you've got to live with what you've got. If the data isn't what you expect it to be, and you've got to have a look at what your green claims are and maybe modify them or change a product. There's things you can do if you're properly informed. Have the right people to lead the project. You know, ultimately it's a process mapping and a data collection exercise for an SME. So you just need people who've got that kind of mindset within your team, and they may not be the obvious people. It might be, you know, certainly the person that we've got in our business who takes the lead on quality and all this stuff has got no scientific background, but they've got that kind of organizational mentality that sort of feeds into it. So I'd be open-minded about the people in your company that can do this kind of thing. And then how do you choose an expert? And I think it's probably a useful thing for maybe Jane to feed into, because it's certainly something that we went through this process about 5-6 years ago now, and it was difficult, finding appropriate consultants, although we were fortunate in that we knew one that had worked up with us before. But, you know, choosing an expert or a consultant is quite a challenge. And just because it's daunting isn't a reason not to do it. And it does look daunting, but it's not as tricky as it looks. Understand the process. So as I said, it's an exercise in mapping and data collection first and foremost, and then understanding the boundaries and allocations. So just on the allocation, so in our case, our impacts are allocated on an economic basis. So, you know, there is criticism of sheep farming, for instance, in that it produces a lot of methane, and those in turn have impacts, which is true. But what we've got to do is to work out the economic value of all those outputs, and then work out on an economic basis, because what the rationale, or sorry, what the allocation of those impacts are for our products, and relative to the other costs of the farming outputs, the wool that we use is very low impact. We chose to set the boundary at a point where we thought was fair, and there's a temptation to try and fudge the boundaries to make your product look better, and we didn't do that. We could have put the wool cleaning process outside the boundary, because strictly speaking it's a rendering process, but we thought it was disingenuous to do that, so we included those impacts into our LCA and our EPD, because we wanted it to be the most honest assessment of our product, and not to, you know, not to try and pull the wool over people's eyes, and excuse the pun. You know, it's important to ask the experts to speak in plain English, because it's a subject where you can just get bamboozled extremely quickly. And the problem with being bamboozled is it's off-putting, and for an SME is probably a very strong motivator for not doing anything. And as we've heard from the previous speakers, you know, the imperative to get a verified EPD is just increasing. So you don't want to wait until it's too late to do it. we provide regular training and updates for our staff so that they can buy into the process. Again, but this is a culture within our business that sustainability is not a box ticking exercise. I see a lot of box ticking, but that's not something we bring into our business. And that helps strengthen the team. That's important for us because Thermofleece is a brand that's sort of predicated on sustainability. We're not perfect, no one is, but it's central to what we do, and we're always trying to get better at it. And what we focus on is providing easy explanations to apparently complex documents. So if anyone wants to email me through the ASBP or whatever, I'm happy running through things if you have any questions, because there's lots of jargonese that's used that turns off a lot of people. Timeline, I've sort of put this slide up, but it doesn't really mean anything because our process sort of COVID straddled our whole process, but we obtained quotes and had a kick-off meeting. And between our kick-off meeting with our expert, that was Andrew Norton at Renewables, we chose Andrew because I'd worked with him on some LCA work he had done on our product as part of his PhD some time ago. So he wasn't entirely new to the process and the product. We had a kick-off meeting in July, and then the LCA, the life cycle assessment, was complete in October, which is about 3 months. Then COVID hit. But typically drafting the EPD would probably take another 3 months and then a month to get it verified. So we're probably looking about 6 to 9 months from start to finish. I don't know if that's along the lines of what Jane would expect or not, but obviously there's a lot of data collection required. It's not a bewildering amount of data, by the way, but there's data that needs to be collected. So 6 to 9 months, as long as you don't sort of sit in your hands waiting for other people to do things, then it's not too difficult, really. Costs. EPD, I think it costs us, we get 2 EPDs and covering 4 products. So we've got 1 EPD for our cozy wool roll, slab and ultra wool, which are sort of variations of the same format. And 1 EPD for our super soft recycled polyester insulation. So we got 4 EPDs and the total cost at 2021 prices. So don't shoot me if these are a lot higher now, because we obviously had a big bump in inflation since then, but it's about 15,000. So and that covers a 5-year period because the EPDs are valid for 5 years. You've got an annual fee. So if you annualize that cost, it was less than 4 grand a year, or less than £1,000 a year per product. So if you're an SME and you're saying you can't afford 15 grand, then you've got to have a look at your budgets and work out where your priorities are, because 15,000, you're probably not going to get a lot of change out of that doing two exhibitions or 2 shows. And so you just got to work out where you're going to put your budget. If you haven't got a 15 grand marketing budget as an SME, you've got to question whether you've got the right business model there and funding model for your business. So I don't believe, and I can say this because I'm living it, I don't believe that EPDs are too expensive for small businesses. It's just a question of prioritizing where you spend your money. And there are lower cost ways of doing these things, but you've just got to be mindful that sometimes you get what you pay for. Learnings, well, it's manageable and affordable. I believe it's a high priority. It should be a high priority, particularly if you're, like us, running a business along sustainable lines. Creates a greater understanding of your proposition and gives you the confidence. And it provides an opportunity for the rest of the team to learn that as well. I've just put on the side here what we do with our EPD internally. So we've just got a document that we use where we've just got these little bubbles where we explain all the aspects of an EPD in plain English, and we just run through that in our training sessions and what have you. And if you're going to do it, just pick the right people for the task. You know, it's sort of seen as a very sciencey thing, but actually a lot of it is data collection in the first instance and process mapping. And, you know, a good expert will be able to talk you through that. So you don't necessarily need to pick the most sciencey person to do it. I'm the most sciencey person in our business, but I'm probably the least organized. So, you know, someone that's got maybe some good, strong organizational skills might be a better one. And I think it's important that the EPD is part of a picture and it's a working document. You know, it's not a box tick. If you run your business along the lines of everything being a box tick, then it'll bleed into things, the culture of your business, and it's not the right way to go as far as I'm concerned. A little bit on biogenic carbon storage, because we've talked about it, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. So the EN 15804 EPD doesn't show the time value of carbon. So biogenic carbon that's locked up for a long period of time is not, the benefit of that is not reflected in the EPD, because the biogenic carbon removals and emissions are balanced to zero over the product life cycle. So you'll see a negative GWP at the upfront stage, which is A, and you'll see a negative positive on C, and it sort of nets out. And people can get a bit disgruntled about that, but that's the rules. But that doesn't mean that you can't illustrate the biogenic carbon storage benefit of your product. It just means within the context of 15804, the biogenic carbon is balanced to zero over the life cycle of the product. But if you go to the RICS professional standard, Appendix N, you know, it says there that there's a story, there's a benefit to biogenic carbon storage, and it gives it gives examples of approaches that can be used to quantify and report the biogenic carbon, the benefit of the biogenic carbon storage, which needs to be presented as additional information. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it can also be used from a product comparison point of view, as long as you're comparing apples with apples. And some of those approaches include the dynamic approaches that we've heard about, the dynamic LCA, which essentially involves applying a delayed emissions or a weighting factor to the biogenic carbon. So what you're saying is, over a 100-year period, you can't claim 100% of the carbon benefit, because outside the life cycle of the product, some of that benefit is carried forward, or it might be released. But you know, it's reasonable to believe that if that carbon's being locked up for a meaningful amount of time, that you're within your rights and to claim the benefit of that. And if you're using a method that covers the product life cycle, then you can actually claim the biogenic carbon benefit and still be in line with the Green Claims Code. You're just using a different method to illustrate it, but you're taking data that you've obtained through the LCA and the EPD process in order to inform that calculation. So, you know, being able to claim biogenic carbon storage benefit and being able to report results from EN 15804 are not mutually exclusive. I think it's also important that you don't see the biogenic carbon storage as a very easy offset, because the whole point is that you're trying to make products that, you know, that have a low embodied carbon of manufacturer. So what I certainly don't want to see happen is that people get lazy about the impacts of the production, because they believe that the biogenic carbon is going to offset that. What we've got to see is the biogenic storage as an input into a bigger carbon sink. So what we're doing by recognizing biogenic carbon storage benefit is to say, particularly when we're looking at timber, for example, is to say we're extending the carbon sink out of the forest and into the built environment. And provided that we can do that in a fair and credible way, I don't see an issue with that. You know, I mean, claiming that there's zero biogenic carbon storage benefit, or claiming that 100% of the stored carbon can be allocated to the benefit, I think are sort of two extremes that we need to avoid, and that taking a dynamic approach allows us to take a more sensible approach to it. But I think it's really important that we understand that we're not trying to use the biogenic carbon as an offset, but as an inflow into a bigger carbon sink that is the built environment.
2 minutes, Mark, please.
Yeah, that's all right, because I think I'm just about wrapped up. Again, getting back to the green claims, must consider the full life cycle of the product or service. I hear quite a bit of negative mood music when we're talking about RICS V2 and the fact that EN 15804 balances carbon to zero. Well, they're the procedures, you know, these are the rules that we follow, but there are opportunities beyond that in order to illustrate the importance of the biogenic carbon benefit within the full life cycle of the product. So, and again, just going back to the EPD, the data that we've collected as part of the LCA and the whole process informs those. So it enables us to make claims that we're very confident to make. And I think that's the end of it. I don't think any of the pictures have much relevance to what I was saying, but there was something nice to look at if you couldn't be bothered listening to me. But thanks anyway.
Thank you, Mark. That's your usual humor, but some plain English. So thank you very much for that sort of very pragmatic approach, manufacturer's approach and SME's approach to getting an EPD. So I asked you at the beginning to put your questions in the Q&A, and you've completely ignored me, which I'm quite amused to see. There are 4 questions in the Q&A, now 5, I think. So 4 of them have been answered. So thank you, Frank, and thank you, Jane, for being particularly good at responding to all the questions. So I think all of those questions there, we'll put the Q&A out to everybody, as well as the recording and the slides from everybody. So you'll be able to see those, but you can have a look if you click on the Q&A. So we've got a question about reuse and EPDs for reused products. And yes, there is an EPD for reused steel. A couple of our members, so EMR and Cleveland Steel, have done EPDs for reused steel. So Jane's thankfully put a bit more information in around that. And then the rest of you have been posting questions in the chat. So I'm trying to multitask and go back to the chat. It seems that Jane has been equally fantastic and responding to many of your questions in the chat. So thank you very much, Jane, much appreciated. So let me just...
There is one for Mark from Marina at Anglian Water at the bottom in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. So Marina from Anglian Water asks, did you revise your manufacturing or construction processes to improve your environmental impact and optimize your process and your costs? So a quick question to you, Mark. Did it have any effect upon your processes?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing thing, really. What's interesting was that, you know, we use a LDPE packaging, and we get a lot of kickback on that. And it was interesting looking at the EPD, the impact, you know, of the packaging that we use. was a lot less than that you would perceive. But yeah, I mean, we've certainly made subtle changes to the composition, and we've got certainly things in the our product development pipeline to improve. But we got the EPD issued in 21. Things just take a little bit of time.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So I did have a bit of an update from James Fisk, who's head of BCIS and who heads up the Building and Environmental Carbon database that Jane mentioned, which is a RICS product. There are apparently 34,000 EPDs on the BEC database, and version 2 has version 2 been launched? Jane, have I think it was supposed to be launched this month, and maybe I missed it, but
the ICE database or BECD? I don't.
The BECD, yeah. James,
I've not seen anything. No.
No. Okay. So that's probably forthcoming. So I do know that the net zero carbon building standard folk were encouraged to put their case studies up into that database. So there are, I think, now something like 400 odd projects on that database. So we are starting to get the beginning of a benchmarking tool. So congratulations to everybody involved in that. I think there are 2,000 registered users. It is free to sign up to. I would perhaps urge you to sign up to it. I don't know, Mark, whether your EPDs are there on the BEC database. I'm not sure.
I'll check. I don't know.
Worth checking. I know that we're still going through sort of various beta phasing testing and so on. So quick question, Jane. So who is in charge, if you like, of embodied carbon within UK government? Is there one department? No. So
I don't know if they are still DLUC but housing and communities have responsibility for it because it comes under building regulations. So if they were going to regulate, it would be DLUC that would do it. So they have a team looking at it. But then there is also a Department for Net Zero, Energy Security and Net Zero. They also are looking at it, particularly at products like steel and concrete, and how government can procure those. So they're leading the work, for example, with IDDI, looking at benchmarking and how to procure low carbon steel and concrete within government. And then kind of BEIs have a kind of watching brief, if you like, because they're responsible for all the kind of regulations to do with carbon taxes and things like that are the other kind of driver to or to make sure it works, if you like.
Yeah. Okay, nothing's quite simple, is it? But yeah, I did meet the MCHLG embodied carbon team the other day, so that was quite refreshing. I did ask them for an update on where we were with our report on embodied carbon and the sort of readiness level of the industry to accept regulation. Apparently there's a final draft due very shortly. Apparently that's what they tell me anyway. Frank, yeah, so please, you've got your hand up.
Well, just to share what happened in France, and it's what is happening now in several other countries. It's because of a Paris Agreement where every country has signed up to reduce its carbon emissions. And unfortunately, we understood that it's quite difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emission from transport or from agricultural baseline. So we are in real estate and construction, the easy customer. So it's easy to ask us to reduce by 50% our greenhouse gas emission. And in that case, it's clear that it's what happened in France. We have to cut by 50% the emissions from the building sector by 2040, which is quite difficult to achieve. And of course, as it was mentioned in the chat, we then has to work with the embedded carbon in new construction and retrofit, and it totally changed the kind of construction materials or components or systems or machines that we will implement. Because if you have to cut your greenhouse gas emission by 50%, not only in use, but also in the embedded carbon of a building, you really face a huge challenge to totally change your construction habits. So good luck.
Yeah, lots of learning, and you know, we need to learn quickly. So this is the first event that we've done with RICS WBEF. We'd like to do more. So we've got a feedback form. If you click on the chat, you'll see there's a link there to a feedback form, and we're quite keen to work out what it is that you feel that you need more help with. We do lots of webinars, but there's no point us doing webinars on things that you know already or just too far away, just sort of too over there in life cycle analysis land that is not of daily interest. So we'd be incredibly grateful if you would fill in those feedback forms and let us know where we should be focusing our attention. And I'll be catching up with the RICS team in December to have a chat over to see how we can work together in some webinars in the new year. So I'm mindful of time. It's just past 2 o'clock. So I'd like to say thank you to our speakers today. So a big thank you to Jane and to Frank and to Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really useful and informative session. Do see Jane's PhD. It's linked from our webpage, and we look forward to seeing you at our event either next week or future webinars. Do sign up to our newsletter and stay in touch. So thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.